It was a month earlier when things started to unravel. I'd been a trucker for over a decade, long hauls across the country, just me, the open road, and whatever cargo I was hauling. The job was predictable, almost monotonous, and that's how I liked it. You get used to the isolation, the rhythm of the highway, and the occasional campfire stories at truck stops. I had been assigned a late-night haul from Texas to California. Produce run, nothing special. The route cut through miles of desolate desert, the kind of terrain where it's easy to forget time. The nights out there are unnaturally still, the only sound being the low hum of the rig and the occasional whip of wind against the cab. No cell signal, no civilization for hours, just you and the road. It was on one of those stretches when I saw him for the first time, Jack Iron Mike Michaels. At first it seemed like a regular truck pulling ahead of me, but something about it felt wrong. The rig was massive, an old model that shouldn't have been on the road anymore. It looked ancient, rusted in places, with faded decals from a trucking company I didn't recognize. I didn't think much of it at first, just another trucker, maybe an old-timer clinging to his rig. But then, as I passed the rig at a rest stop that night, I caught a glimpse of the driver. Him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an old trucker's cap. His eyes were dark, hollow, and fixed on me like he knew something I didn't. He didn't blink. He didn't move. Just stared. I tried to shake it off as one of those weird roadside encounters, but it stuck with me. Something about his face. It was the kind of face that haunts you. The next time I saw him, things got stranger. It was a couple of nights later, just after midnight. I was parked at a small rest area, stretching my legs, when I noticed his rig again, parked a few spaces away. I hadn't seen him pull in, and the rest stop was deserted. His truck stood there, silent, almost too still. And then, there he was again, sitting in the cab, watching me. This time, though, I saw more of his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his hands. They looked wrong, too thin, the fingers too long for a man his size. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next week, I kept seeing him. His rig would appear in the distance behind me, the headlights like ghostly eyes following me along the road. I'd pull into a diner, and there he'd be, sitting in a booth, always facing me, always silent. It didn't matter where I went or how fast I drove. Jack Iron Mike Michaels was always there. At first, I thought it was coincidence, maybe some other trucker playing tricks, but it was too frequent, too deliberate. I started asking around at truck stops about him. That's when I learned the full story. Decades ago, Iron Mike was a legend on the road. He was known for his toughness, hence the name, and for always making his runs on time, no matter the conditions. Then one night, he just vanished. They said he was on a run through the desert, same as me, when his rig disappeared. Some thought he had driven off a cliff or gotten lost in the sandstorms, but no one ever found his truck or his body. Some of the older truckers whispered that Iron Mike didn't just die, he was taken. By what they wouldn't say. But the rumor was, if you ever saw his rig on the road, it meant death was close behind. I didn't believe it. Not then, at least. But as the nights wore on and Iron Mike kept appearing, I started to wonder. He wasn't just following me. He was toying with me, like he wanted me to know something, wanted me to understand what was coming. One night I found myself parked at a service station on the edge of the Mojave. The place was practically abandoned, save for a few other trucks lined up under the dim lights. As I walked toward the restrooms, I saw his rig again. This time, it was parked right next to mine. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs feeling like lead. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I approached the cab. The door was slightly ajar, the interior dark. I don't know why, but I reached for the handle. As soon as I touched it, a rush of cold air hit me, freezing in the desert heat. And then, from inside the cab, I heard a whisper, a low, rasping voice. It said one word, "Run." I jerked back, my hand trembling. But when I looked inside, there was no one there, just an empty, decaying seat and the faint smell of diesel. That's when I realized this wasn't just some ghost story. Iron Mike was real, or at least whatever was left of him was real. And now, standing on the side of that remote highway, staring into the headlights of Iron Mike's rig as it roared down the road, I understood. This wasn't about him haunting me. He was leading me, showing me something. But what? I'll never know for sure. because the last thing I remember is the sound of screeching tires and the blinding light. And then, silence. Maybe Iron Mike wasn't warning me. Maybe he was coming to take me with him. Or maybe I'm already gone. And just like that, everything went black. I don't remember hitting the ground, or even if I had time to scream before the world around me disappeared. The rumble of the engine, the blinding lights, they were gone. It was just silence and darkness, like the universe had blinked and I'd been erased from existence. But I wasn't dead. Not yet. I woke up on the side of the highway, my rig parked in the same spot I'd left it. My head was pounding, heart racing, and there was a strange metallic taste in my mouth. For a few moments, I thought I'd dreamt it all. Iron Mike, his rig, the headlights barreling toward me. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Too many late nights, too many miles of empty road. But as I looked around, trying to shake off the disorientation, I realized something wasn't right. The air felt different, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. There were no stars in the sky, no moon, nothing but a dense, inky blackness that stretched in every direction. The desert, usually so full of life at night, with the occasional distant howl of coyotes, was deathly silent. It was as if the world had been muted. Then I saw it. The faint glimmer of headlights on the horizon. Not mine, his. I froze, heart pounding as Jack, Iron Mike Michael's rig came into view, crawling toward me. But it wasn't speeding anymore. It was moving slowly, deliberately, like it was giving me time to process what was happening. And for the first time I realized what all the truckers had meant. This wasn't just about running from Iron Mike or his ghostly rig. He wasn't chasing me anymore. He was waiting. I scrambled back into my cab, locked the doors, and jammed the key into the ignition, praying the engine would roar to life. It did. The hum of the diesel engine felt like a lifeline, a tether to reality. I slammed my foot on the gas and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. His rig was still behind me, creeping along like a shadow that refused to disappear. I drove for what felt like hours, but the strange thing was, the more I tried to outrun him, the slower time seemed to pass. The road stretched on endlessly in front of me, no signs, no other cars, just me, the rig, and the darkness. It was like the desert had swallowed me whole. Then, 2 nights later, everything shifted. It was around midnight when I pulled into a truck stop just outside Barstow. I was exhausted, running on fumes, both figuratively and literally. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, my nerves frayed. As I parked and climbed down from my rig, I noticed something chilling. Jack's rig was there again, parked at the far edge of the lot, shrouded in shadow. This time I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't chalk it up to some coincidence. The truck had been following me for days, no, weeks, and so had he. I glanced toward the diner, its fluorescent lights flickering, casting an eerie glow on the otherwise empty lot. Through the windows, I could see the same figure I'd been seeing for days now. Jack was sitting at the back, just like he always did, staring into a cup of coffee that he never drank. I should have kept walking, ignored it all, gotten back in my rig and left. But something about the way he sat there, perfectly still, made my blood run cold. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the next move. My legs carried me toward the diner before I even realized what I was doing. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, the smell of stale coffee and greasy food filling the air. The waitress behind the counter gave me a nod, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on Jack. He didn't look up as I approached, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Up close, he looked worse than I remembered. Gaunt, almost skeletal. His skin had a sickly pallor, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes, though, were the worst part. They were cold, hollow, as if they belonged to someone who'd already left this world behind. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he didn't. He just kept staring at that cup of coffee. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Jack's head tilted slightly, and for the first time he looked at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was like staring into the abyss, into a darkness that went far beyond death. And then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like the sound of tires crunching gravel on an empty road. "You shouldn't have followed me." I blinked, confused. Followed him? I hadn't been following him. He had been following me. But as the words sank in, I realized what he meant. Jack Iron Mike Michaels wasn't just a ghost story. He wasn't just some trucker who had vanished in the desert all those years ago. He had become something else, something darker. And now, I was part of it. Whether I had meant to or not, I had crossed some invisible line the moment I'd seen him on that stretch of road. The truth hit me like a freight train. Jack wasn't just collecting souls, he was leading us, guiding us into the same fate that had taken him. As I backed away from the booth, my heart racing, I could hear the faint hum of his rig's engine outside. It was time to go, time to run. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. No matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I went, Iron Mike would always be right behind me, waiting. And as I stepped outside into the cold desert night, the headlights of his rig already coming into view, I understood one final thing. I had become part of his story, and there's no outrunning the road once it's claimed you. It was supposed to be just another night at the truck stop. Then I saw him. The man with the empty eyes. It started 2 weeks before, with nothing more than a glance. I was pulling into a rest stop just after midnight. I hadn't slept in days, chasing that paycheck, living on caffeine and adrenaline. That's when I saw him sitting on the curb near a dimly lit bench. His clothes were grimy, his hair long and unkempt. At first, I thought he was just another drifter, until I caught his eyes. They were wrong. Empty, like someone who had seen too much or nothing at all. I tried not to think much of it and settled into my rig, but as I lay there, something felt off. I checked my rearview mirror and there he was, closer now, just standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching my truck. I convinced myself it was paranoia. But over the next few nights, I saw him again at different stops, each time a little closer, each time his presence a little more unsettling. His name was Peter, at least that's what the cashier at a diner told me after I asked around. "Peter's harmless," she said, "but he's always around. Too quiet, that one." But Peter wasn't harmless. The next night, I woke up to the sound of my truck's door creaking open. There he was, standing at the base of my rig, staring up at me. I scrambled, slamming the door shut, locking it. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, watching, as if he was waiting for something. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. I thought I was losing it, but a few days later, I heard the stories. Rumors of a man who lurked at truck stops, following truckers, getting into their rigs, and disappearing without a trace. Some said he was a ghost, others said he was worse, a man who had died on the road, still trying to hitch a ride to the afterlife. The last time I saw Peter, it was at a rest stop deep in the woods. No lights, no other trucks, just me and him. He wasn't sitting this time. He was waiting by the restroom building, staring at me as I pulled in. I didn't even stop. I drove on, heart pounding, afraid that if I did, I'd never leave. I don't know who or what Peter is, but I know one thing. He's not looking for a ride. He's looking for something more. I still can't explain it. Every time I look in the mirror, I see him, the man in the passenger seat who shouldn't be there. It all started a few months ago when I took a job hauling across state lines for a private contractor. The pay was good, but the runs were strange. Always at night, always through remote areas. The first few weeks were fine, but then things got weird. I first noticed it while driving through a mountain pass. The roads were winding, the fog thick, and visibility was nearly zero. I glanced at my side mirror, and for a split second, I saw a man sitting in the passenger seat of my cab. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing, but when I looked again, he was gone. I chalked it up to exhaustion. But it kept happening. Every few nights, I'd catch a glimpse of him, just sitting there, staring ahead, expressionless. Sometimes he'd look at me. Other times, he'd vanish as soon as I turned my head. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? A tired trucker seeing things in his mirrors? But the more it happened, the more I realized it wasn't just my imagination. There were stories, whispers among other drivers about a man who rode along in your truck, appearing in mirrors, but never staying long enough for you to catch him. They said he was a driver who had died in a wreck decades ago, his rig crushed in a head-on collision. His body was never found, but his presence lingered, haunting the roads he once drove. The last time I saw him, I was driving down a desolate stretch of highway late at night. The road was empty, no lights, no signs of life. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, and there he was again, sitting right beside me. This time, he didn't disappear when I turned my head. He was solid, real. His hand reached out slowly, as if trying to grab the wheel. I swerved, nearly crashing into the ditch. When I looked back, he was gone. But I know he'll be back. He's always there, lurking, waiting for his next ride.